Hi, I'm Kristi Arzola. I've been painting with watercolors for over 20 years and love sharing what I've learned with others. Thanks for being here, and I hope you paint along with me. These are the materials I'll be using for today's painting. You're welcome to pause the video and refer to the video description for a complete list. These are the paint colors I'll be using for today's painting. You don't need these exact colors, just use what you have and get somewhere close. If you would like a list of these exact colors, please pause the video and refer to the video description. Also in the video description is a line drawing that you can download and print for free at home. Print it at the scale you wish to paint it and transfer that line drawing directly onto your watercolor paper. If you don't know how to do this, refer to the video in the upper right-hand corner. Before we begin painting today's subject, I want us to lighten the pencil lines that are on our watercolor paper using a kneaded eraser. So I'm just lightly tapping some of these pencil lines, particularly around the shadow, but most of these lines on the cherry itself are going to be hidden by the dark colors we use. So really just that shadow needs to be lightened up. Now, before we begin painting, we're going to need to mask some areas of today's subject for the reflections. So I am going to use a little bit of masking fluid. This is the brand I'll be using today. And in order to protect my tools, I've put a small amount of dish soap in a small cup of water so I can coat my brush with that soap to protect it. That way the masking fluid doesn't ruin my brush. I'm just going to get a small amount on my paintbrush, and I'm going to do a thin line of masking fluid to kind of create this curve near the stem. So I'm holding my brush very vertical. And I want to try and just capture that fun little reflection that we see. It's been a while since I've rinsed in soapy water, so I'm going to do that again. And I'm now going to get more masking fluid so I can mask the reflection at the front of the cherry. Now I don't need, the edges of this reflection to be perfect and smooth, so you can get some texture in there. I'm going to rinse all of this masking fluid completely out of my brush using that soapy water so I don't ruin it. And I'm going to apply just a little bit of masking fluid on the stem of the cherry so I can paint the cherry freely, and if I bump into the stem, it's not going to hurt anything. So this is just going to give me peace of mind and be able to be a little bit more efficient with my pace. Now I don't have to mask the entire height, just the lower area where my cherry colors will be. I'm going to get all of that masking fluid out of my brush using that soapy water, and I'm going to rinse once more in my regular water so my brush is completely clean again. Now while that masking fluid is drying, I'm going to use my number 10 round to begin mixing up some paint colors for this cherry. Now I want some really dark, rich colors, and it's a really small scale, so I don't need a whole lot of water on my palette. So smaller than a dime, so just the size of a pea, I would say. For this cherry, I'm going to be using alizarin crimson, but I'm going to have a few different variations of it. And because I want this cherry to be dark and vibrant, I'm going to use this alizarin crimson pretty heavily as a base for 3 of the colors. And then I'm just going to tint these colors by adding others. So I've mixed up 3 really dark, vibrant alizarin crimsons. So the first alizarin crimson, I am going to add just the smallest amount of ultramarine blue. So it's just a lighter maroon color. So that's the first color I'm going to work with. The next one, I am going to be heavier handed with my ultramarine blue. So I can make a darker So this is my second color, so it's a darker color yet. And then for my third alizarin crimson, I'm going to use that ultramarine blue to darken it up, but then I'm going to go a step further and add a little bit of Payne's gray to really push the color. So it almost looks like a dark purplish black. So very fun. So to start off with, I'm going to apply clean water to just the cherry. And since I have that masking fluid, I don't need to worry about the reflections. I don't need to worry about the stem. I can just go right over top of it all. But I am going to do my best to keep my water inside the body of my cherry. So everything is very glossy right now on the cherry itself, but I want to make sure there's no standing puddles so that my color doesn't get completely diluted. So I'm going to dry my brush off and soak up any puddling paint or puddling water before I introduce my color. So now that everything is completely wet, I'm going to add that first alizarin crimson, so the lightest maroon color. And I'm just going to paint the entire cherry using this color to start off with. Notice how when I'm up against the edge of my cherry, I try to drag my brush in one smooth stroke to get a nice clean outside edge. Sometimes I'll see my students dragging their brush in a way like they're sketching with a pencil, and that gives them a lot of bumps and wobbles on the outside edge. So just slow down and try to trace that outside edge in one stroke if you can manage it. Now, if there's any puddling paint, I want to soak that up. Now, while this is still wet, I'm now going to get the second darkest maroon color, and I'm going to focus more on the top. So I'm going to go just below the reflection and above. And I want to be mindful that the white table the cherry's sitting on is creating some reflection right on the bottom of the cherry. So I don't want to bring those darks all the way to the bottom edge. I want to give some distance. Right on the back side of the stem, I want to darken up some of those colors. So now I'm going to completely dry my brush. I didn't rinse it, I just dried it off on my sponge. And I'm going to use this dry brush to soak up any puddling paint, and I can use it to control the shape of these darks. So I'm just going through with firm pressure using a dry brush to essentially control where that darker maroon is going. So if I don't want it down in the bottom of my cherry, I got to use that dry brush and kind of drag it along that bottom edge to soak it up. Now before I allow this to dry, I'm going to switch to my number 2 round. And since everything is still very glossy, I know that I still have some working time. So I'm going to get that really, really dark color that we mixed up with that added Payne's gray. And right at the base of the reflection towards the top, I'm going to get some of that color in. And I'm really wiping away the excess paint on my brush so it doesn't completely dominate and take over all the existing colors that I've already achieved. So I'm trying to be mindful with not overloading my brush. And you can kind of see these fun kind of curved lines that I'm creating with these shadow colors. So it's following the contour of the cherry. And then we also have a very thin kind of dimple down towards the center, but I need to really wipe away the excess paint that's on my brush before I drag my brush to create that line. Now, once you start to see your paper losing that gloss and areas are beginning to dry, we need to kind of get out. So I'm using a clean, dry brush to just make some adjustment to the outside shapes of my shadow. So I'm basically cleaning it up, essentially. And once I'm done with that, then I need to hit this with the blow dryer because any additional details need to be done on another layer. So it's time to dry. Now that everything is completely dry, I can begin adding more details to the cherry. For this, I'm going to use my number 6 round, and I am going to get that second darkest maroon color. So this is what I'm working with. And I'm going to add this color on the top half of the cherry just to get it to be darker. Now I want to really load my brush up with this color so I don't run out mid-paint stroke. And I want to go across this cherry and up so I can darken up this upper half. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now, while that upper half of the cherry is drying, we're going to work on the shadow. I'm going to put some clean water on my palette. I'm going to get a small amount of Payne's Gray, and I'm going to tint it a little bit with that maroon to accommodate where the reflective color will be. I also want a second Payne's Gray that is darker for the cast shadow. I'm now going to use clean water to go directly below my cherry. And I'm going to bring this clean water up only about halfway. You may still have a faint line provided by your line drawing when you did your transfer to show the shape of the shadow. So be mindful of that. But this first initial application of water tends to be absorbed really fast. When I tip my paper, you can kind of see where that water is. Now I'm going to grab that really light gray that is tinted with the purple. I'm going to soak up any puddling paint to thin it out a bit. Now I'm going to switch to my small number 2 round to get that darker Payne's Gray, but I'm going to make sure to wipe away the excess paint on my sponge or paper towel. And I want to get as close to the bottom of the cherry as possible to create the cast shadow. So this is the darkest part of the shadow, closest to our subject. Really take your time on this part. Once you're happy with the shape of your cast shadow, you may feel like part of the remaining shadow may need to be a little darker. So before it dries, I'm just adding a little bit more color to just part of my shadow. And before I let this dry, I'm going to clean my brush off and use a clean, dry brush just to control the shape of my shadow before I let this dry. I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so we can move on to the next step. Now that everything is completely dry, I am going to be accentuating some of the darkest shadows of the cherry. For these dark shadows, I'm going to be using a number 2 round, and the color I'll be using is this really dark Payne's gray and maroon mixture we made up. So I want to start at the front of the reflection that we masked. It has a rounded end, and it moves in front of that thin white reflection. It becomes a little whiter as it reaches this left edge, and it swoops close to the top as it reaches the very back point of the cherry. And I want it to pop out on the opposite side. I also want a dark shadow to start at the base of my stem and to kind of come up and meet with that shadow. On the opposite side of the stem, I want to come up at a strong diagonal and curve around before coming in contact with that last shadow I just made. Now I'm going to come right in front of the masking fluid on the right upper corner, and I'm going to create kind of this fun little swoop that thins out and curves down. So it kind of goes along that corner. Now I'm going to start at the bottom point of that shape. I'm going to come back up while leaving some space. Now I'm going to go to that upper left corner. I'm going to follow that thin dark shadow that we had started. And I'm going to kind of curve it across to the left. I'm going to go right behind the area that we applied masking fluid, right at the base of the stem. And I'm just going to darken that area up. I'm going to add a little water to this color so it's more of a glaze, so the consistency of tea. And I'm just going to accentuate kind of that center point of the cherry. Now, currently, I have not been able to capture, the core shadow that cuts through the cherry right here. So I need to do a glaze for that as well. So the same glaze I used for the center half of the cherry, I am now going to use to kind of glaze that core shadow. So I don't want to go all the way to the bottom because I want to leave room for the reflected light. And I just want to kind of curve up using really gentle pressure so I don't gouge the previous layers. And I'm using a quality brush that is really soft. And I just need to let that dry. Because I know from experience, the more I play with it, the more I'm going to gouge those other layers. And it's just not worth the risk. I'm going to get a little bit of that core shadow on the opposite side here. And I'm going to let that dry. Now this core shadow or the glaze I did there's just ever so slightly an area with a hard edge that I'm not a fan of. So I'm actually going to get my 3/4 inch filbert brush with some water, and I'm going to get a paper towel that's handy. And what I want to do, and this is a risk, so you guys don't have to do this either. I am just going to do a very gentle pass with this brush and clean water along that built-up pigment edge that was left from the glaze. And my hope is that I can just lift a tiny bit of color so it looks like that reflective color from the table, while at the same time hiding that kind of hard edge from the glaze. Now I am not going to dab this with a paper towel. So I am just going to let that be. It's not perfect, but you know what? Every painting comes with a lesson. Okay, I'm now going to remove the masking fluid. I can do that with my fingers, or I can do that with a rubber cement pickup. So a rubber cement pickup is really nice. It allows us to do this in a really clean way. I always feel like it when I remove masking fluid using my fingers, there's always a little bit left that I can't seem to get with my fingers. So a rubber cement pickup just kind of gives me peace of mind. So I'm now going to use a number 2 round, and on the outside edge of this reflection, I'm going to use a little bit of water just to kind of soften up that edge a bit. This will also make the reflection look a little more natural. So I'm just coming in with clean water on my small brush, doing a little scrubbing, and when I see it starting to lighten up, I dab with a clean paper towel. Now that looks a little bit more natural. I'm going to do the same thing on the areas that we masked up near the stem. So I'm just taking my brush to soften some of those areas and to clean up some of the edges. I'm now going to take my number 6 round and mix up some sap green. I need very little water because this is such a small shape. And I will also mix up a little bit of sap green with some yellow. I'm going to use the cadmium yellow for this. And I'm going to paint wet on dry for this stem. This is just layer 1. So just wet on dry with that cadmium yellow and a little bit of sap green. At the very bottom of this stem, I can use a little bit of burnt sienna just to give a little bit more of a rusty orange coloring to it. And this is while that lime green is still damp. Can also add a little bit of this towards the top of the stem and maybe along part of the edge. I'm going to continue painting wet on dry using this burnt sienna. Right at the very end of my stem. And then I'm going to get a little bit of water on my brush. And I'm just going to use the water to kind of pull that color into the rest of it. Some parts of the stem are dry, some stem parts are still damp. I'm going to get the really dark Payne's Gray purple mixture we used on the cherry and into areas at the end of this stem. I'm going to add very small amounts of this dark color just to give some hints of shadow. I can do the same thing at the very base of the stem. I can give some vertical lines just to kind of hint at some texture. I'm just continuing with that dark purple color. It's a little bit more of a glaze. And if I run into damp areas, that's okay. Some areas are more dry, so I'm getting more definition and detail. The shadow is mostly on the right side of our stem, but our stem has a lot of wonderful, texture to it. So I'm trying to be very light-handed with my brush work. You can barely see the bristles of my brush bending. I'm going to continue with this really dark purple because now the end of the stem is practically dry, so I can get a little bit more definition there. And I don't want to fill the whole thing in with dark color. I just want to keep pushing the darks of any shadows and divots inside the texture. I'm going to get a little bit of burnt sienna on my brush. So I can darken up some browns at the base of the stem. We're going to get some of that sap green on my brush. And lastly, if you feel it's necessary, you can grab a little bit of bleed-proof white or even white gouache if you have it. So either one of these will do if you want to add any additional little white details. Bleed-proof white is a little more opaque than the white gouache. I make sure to wipe away the excess so it's not too heavy. And right on the very front of the stem, I just want to add a little bit of white highlights. If I want, I can come in to the white reflection of the cherry and just add a little bit of bright white highlights there as well. If I'm not happy with some of the white highlights on my cherry, I can clean them up using this paint. Couple little white highlights on the very end of the stem. And I have an area where some of my paint color kind of went outside my cherry shape, so I'm just going to hide some of that pink tint. But otherwise, I'm happy with this cherry. I think sometimes starting with a simpler subject when you're learning how to paint with watercolors realistically, fruit is a great place to begin. So I hope you give it a shot. I'd love to see your finished paintings, and hopefully we can paint again next week. If you've been enjoying my watercolor tutorials and would like to support the channel, consider buying me a cup of coffee or a tube of watercolor paint. A $5 Venmo contribution is always appreciated, but never expected. Your support helps make future tutorials possible.